on NDC. And she's going to walk through where we are as far as in functionality and being ready to accept all NDC transactions. So with that, prior to turning it over to Shelly, just to let everyone know, we are recording the webinar today. And it will be posted. Also, please feel free to ask any questions. We will be taking questions throughout the presentation. So if you have questions, submit them on the side where there's actually a question section. And we'll be happy to answer those. We've also built in some time at the end of the webinar. So if you don't have a question during the presentation but have one after, please feel free to submit it at that time. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shelly.
Great. Thank you very much, Crystal. And again, welcome to the webinar. I appreciate those who've joined, and I'm very excited to present the information we have here. So without further ado, let's just briefly go over what we're going to cover today. So we're going to talk very high level about airline distribution. I'm going to give a very quick NDC refresher for those that may have either forgotten or don't know about the traditional distribution model, and then distribution with NDC. And then we're going to move on to kind of the meat of our webinar today, which is what ARC has done recently to our settlement product to be able to support enhanced distribution strategies. So we're going to walk through those changes and talk about what they mean, and then of course wrap up in questions. But as Crystal said, please feel free to ask questions during the webinar. I'm happy to stop if I can and answer as many questions as possible. So first, let's just do a quick refresher on NDC. So what is NDC? Well, what NDC really is an XML standard which allows airlines to differentiate their airline products. And some of the important things about it are that it's one standard partners, and which can improve time to market with the various products that airlines want to distribute. It also does support personalized offers by allowing agents to provide customer details before the ticket is issued, and of course allows for the transmission of rich content, which is a way to visually display product features. So that is just a very high-level refresher on NDC. So let's talk about what this really means. So in the distribution channel today, in the agency channel, the way things typically work are that fares and schedules are distributed through third parties, and those third parties then send various GDSs, and when the agency goes into search, the GDS will then communicate with the airline on the availability. And the important part here is that in this case today, for the most part, the GDS is the one building the offer from the schedules, fare rules, and availability. So that's a key point in how distribution is done today. And then, of course, the agency will then do the search within the GDS and provide a number of different options to their customers in a variety of formats, either online or via phone or through a corporate booking tool. So let's talk a little bit about NDC and what it allows. Well, the premise behind NDC was to allow the airline to build the offer and through a variety of distribution mechanisms. So for example, the agency would use the XML schemas that are out there today provided by IATA, and they would get to the airline's content one of three ways. An agency can either go direct to the airline through the airline API, or the agency can go through a third party an aggregator, and there are many companies that are sort of jumping into the aggregator role. The agency can also go through the GDS, and in this case, the GDS really can play the role of the aggregator. And some of the key things about the GDS are that, of course, the GDS can take the traditional content that's out there today. They can take direct content from the airline and display it to the agency. And from many conversations that I've had and a number of meetings that I've gone to, a lot of folks see this sort of hybrid approach, meaning the agency kind of goes through the GDS and they see a variety of content, the filed content that we think of today that I just talked about, and again, the direct content. So I want to stress here that, of course, the main difference here is that the airline is the one building and owning the offer in this case. The XML schema is what's used to do the booking, the shopping, the actual final ticketing. So that is what is used to communicate between the parties. So it looks like a question here. So give me just a second. Oh, can I mention a few aggregators? Absolutely. So you have, and probably many of these you may not have heard of yet, because a great many of them are in sort of the European theater today. So we have folks like JR Technologies, and if you do a Google search for them, you'll be able to get a lot of details on them and their products, but they've actually been sitting in on the NDC meetings from the very beginning, and they have built that communication, those XML messages, to send back and forth between the parties. So that's an example of one. There's a company called IBS that is also out there that has jumped in the mix. And to be honest with you, a company, Fairlogics, which most of you may have heard of, actually does count in the aggregator world. So those are just some examples of aggregators. And I'm happy to send out a listing of those if everyone is interested. I can do that along with the deck. I've had someone speak up and say TP Connect as well. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. Again, I'm happy to add a list of aggregators to the distribution afterwards. So thank you very much for the question. So I want to now move on to, like I said, sort of the meat of what we're talking about here today, and that is how ARC is supporting new distribution methods. And one of the things that I would say we've heard a lot from airlines is, and we've heard this for many years, and we had a settlement council last year, which many of you may have heard about. We had a press release and several postings, and that, of course, was part of the feedback that we got from the airline community, is that not everyone is implementing NDC in the same way. And so it's important for ARC to have a variety of options to allow carriers to stay with the traditional method as long as they want, and progress along kind of what we call a continuum, which we'll get into a little bit more. The thought was that, of course, the airlines really wanted us to support what they call a pure NDC concept, and that concept is what I just talked about a few moments ago, where the airline completely controls the offer. They issue the ticket through XML messages, again, from the agency, so refunds, exchanges, those kind of things are all done through the NDC XML messages. And really, the airline sort of owns the offer and owns the ticket. So in terms of what we call pure NDC, that's what they're referring to. And of course, flexible output formats. Again, we'll talk about that here more in just a moment. Improving the accuracy of commissions. Once again, if you're looking at a pure NDC model where the airline is actually doing the offer, in that case, the airline would actually apply the upfront commission when the offer is made to the agency, or potentially if there are any fare discounts allowed. And that is all up to whatever the airline and the agency agree to as they move into. Important to discuss is how you're going to move forward. There was some modernization of our business rules. Again, we'll get into more of that here in just a moment. And then, of course, as always, considering the return on an investment for any changes that we've made. Then on the agency side, new distribution, they really want to try to make it as simple as possible. It's not always easy to do that, but we're doing our best. There has been some skepticism around the NDC and direct connect models, although I think you'll see a lot more news lately about agencies going into direct arrangements with select airlines. And in all honesty, we think that's how, at least in the US, we see it moving forward for some time. Is that as and look to enter into an NDC type relationship. More automation, obviously the better. Really, one big issue that came up was about moving faster to address fragmentation in the industry. And that is something that, I guess, when I talked a minute ago about the GDS playing that role as aggregator, that's where they really step into the mix here, is that they can provide the agency with a tool and a display that brings in multiple types of content and displays to the agency. So we're happy to see the GDSs have jumped in, and we think that that will help address some of the fragmentation that's happening. And then, of course, the ability to an interesting part is that in the kind of the pure NDC model, if the airline is actually pricing the transaction and issuing the ticket, there should not be any mistakes. And so the agency would potentially not have a way to override, so there really shouldn't be any need for debit memos at all, which is one of the big positives in moving this direction. So as I mentioned earlier, we see airlines today on what we call kind of a distribution continuum, all the way from the far left, where there are airlines that have said, you know, we understand the benefits of NDC, but we're just not ready to go there yet. We might be looking at it in the future, or we might not be looking at it at all. And the traditional GDS distribution we spoke about. Then you have airlines on the far right of the continuum, which are really looking to push a large volume of their indirect or agency sales channel transactions through the NDC mechanism within the next several years. And then you have this variety of airlines in between that are looking at a variety of hybrid approaches. So in other words, I might be airline B, and I might say, well, I'm going to stick with traditional GDS distribution for the bulk of my US transactions, but for these three agencies, maybe let's pretend they're in a large OTA or they're a high leisure agency, we may want to pursue NDC with them. So that would be kind of the target approach. Lines that want to pursue sort of what I call the far right or the pure NDC model, they may do that in a couple of regions, but not other regions. So that's why we actually kind of put this on a continuum, and I think it's important because the flexibility that we're offering had to really cover a number of different scenarios. So I'm going to pause here because I think we have another question, and the question is, So the agent is not issuing the ticket, the airline does when using NDC. So I will throw a caveat here. It does depend on how you implement NDC, but for the most part, the airlines that are pursuing NDC are looking to take advantage of the benefits of the airline and price. The airline would issue the ticket, but I will say that that does not have to happen. The airline can actually do the shopping and the booking, and the ticketing can be actually done outside the airline. But I have to say that at least in some of the conversations I've had, that model is being looked at by a limited number of airlines where they don't do the ticketing. So let's see, I have another question here. Giving back the authority of the inventory to the airline will increase the volume of transactions they will receive. Do you think the airlines will be able to manage the increase of transactions without losing the quality of response? Excellent question, and I will tell you that that has come up multiple times in a variety of industries that I have been attending, and airlines are looking, considering that when they're implementing NDC. All of them have talked about that. They are working with their technology providers who are helping them implement NDC, and so yes, that has to be a consideration for the airline when you turn on a higher volume of having people come in and hit your reservation system and do shopping. And because it literally, in some cases, increased your by 100-fold. So you've got to be ready for that. That's a great question. Thank you. So now let's talk about the enhancements we just made. So we've been doing some testing from last November to this January. Our code implemented very recently on February the 8th to support a variety of NDC models. And what that means is that for the airline and the agency that want to and choose to enter into kind of setting up NDC, we will be able to accept those NDC transactions on airline or neutral ticket stock. And for those that are not familiar with neutral ticket stock, that is ARC's ticket stock that we actually distribute to the GDSs, and then the GDSs, of course, issue those form codes and issue tickets, EMDs, and COs. So we will actually be able to accept NDC transactions in on airline or neutral ticket stock. We will also be able to process two files called the sales file we get in from the GDSs, and one aggregator today called the SPRF file, the System Provider Reporting file. And that's been the case for, I don't know, a couple of decades that I know of. We are going to be able to take in the REP format. Obviously, there's a little asterisk there, and that means that there is some limited functionality with processing the RET because of the resolutions between the rest of the world and the US on the certain transaction types, specifically exchanges. How exchanges are processed in the IATA world, around the world of BSPs, is a bit different than how they are here and how our system is set up to take exchanges. So there are some limitations by taking in the REP file. We have also integrated with IATA's NDC Link tool. So if you're already creating a REP file today that you're sending into NDC Link with a limited amount of work with them, they can actually parse out the REP file, send the international transactions to the appropriate BSP, and then send ARC, our US point of sale transactions, through an existing mechanism we already have in place. So that's fantastic. That's brand new functionality. For credit card billing, today, for the most part, we initiate credit card billing for travel agency transactions on behalf of our airline. The airlines are typically the merchants. And so I want to include those NDC transactions along with my .com or my phone center transactions. So they've asked us to put in functionality that inhibits the ability to bill credit cards. Even though they may send those transactions to us for reporting purposes, and we'll get to that here in just a moment, we would not initiate credit billing. But that is an option. We can do it or not do it. Do I need to stop here and take a question or two? Or okay. Here, I'll circle back around. We'll finish going through this. So today, in our sales reporting tool that travel agencies use called IAR, Interactive Agent Reporting, as transactions come into us from the GDSs, if there is a problem or it triggers one of our business edits, and we will advise the agency what the error is, and generally, for the most part, they can correct that error, and then the transaction continues to go through our settlement process and is extracted and sent to the airline. So with NDC, depending again on how you implement, but let's just pretend for a moment, you've issued the transaction, you priced it, you kind of own it, you don't want the agency to make any post-ticketing changes to that transaction, even if there is an error. So we have the option to either continue to allow the agency to correct the error or place any transaction that is in error on a reject file, send that reject file back to the airline for review and resubmission. So that, again, it's an option for whatever the carrier would like to do. We are putting the identifier in the agency sales reporting tool, IAR, so that the agency is fully aware that it is NDC, and if the airline has said, well, I don't want errors to be corrected, you can also, I need to add one more thing into that error correction, you can also limit the ability to do voids and refunds and exchanges in IAR. You can also have the option to limit modifications. And so I'll describe the modifications real quick for those who don't know. If a transaction comes in today and it is not in error, an agency still has the ability to modify 5 fields. And those fields are commission, tour code, ticket designator, waiver code, and type B certificate, only to those 5 fields if the transaction is not in error. And the airline, in the case of NDC transactions, you have the option to prevent those changes from happening as well. So I'll recap. You can have the option to prevent transactions, agencies correct errors in IAR. You have the option to either allow or not allow voids, refunds, and exchanges in IAR. And then you can allow or not allow modifications for commission, waiver code, tour code, ticket designator, and type B certificate. So I'll circle back around. The NDC identifier is displayed to the agency in IAR, and that lets them know, as well as an error message, if they go in and try to actually correct an error or modify a transaction or do something that the airline and the agency have agreed the error message to the agency, but they will have an identifier. We will also output NDC and non-NDC transactions on the agency back office file. So today, the agency has the ability to either automatically set up or go request a back office file to be sent from IAR to their systems, and they use it for a variety of things. reconciliation to the GDS transactions, invoicing, billing, a number of things. So, and they can actually request several box files throughout the day. So we will actually output both NDC and non-NDC on the box file, and of course we'll output NDC and non-NDC on the carrier accounting tape that we send out today to the airline. To the question that's put out. So besides all the implementation benefits of NDC, I guess most important point is the transfer of information about NDC to the stakeholders within the supply chain. What do you think about the speed of change, about the perception of this new indirect ecosystem? Are the stakeholders aware of all the benefits and risks about NDC? Another fantastic question, thank you. I would say, as with anything this complex that impacts our industry, there are a variety of answers to your question. I think there's a lot more knowledge and information about the benefits and challenges of NDC today than there were a couple of years ago. But what I find, at least in the US market, is about A, what it really is. What is NDC? What does it mean? What are the benefits and the challenges? So for an agency that decides they want to go a direct API to the airline, there's obviously some technology changes and investment that has to happen. So it's unclear yet what that really means. Servicing has come up quite a bit recently in terms of, well, you know, we say, well, the issuance, the straight sale, the issuance of the ticket is actually pretty easy. It's what happens afterwards that's unexpected that built into the NDC process is not really sort of fully available, I shouldn't say available, is not fully present with all airlines today. The original focus has been a lot on straight sales. So I think all in all, no, there's still a lot of, I think there, and this is where we're kind of hoping, you know, we'll step up a bit more this year, to be honest. And we're going to be doing a lot more of these webinars. We are out meeting with both airlines and agencies. And one of the things that I definitely want to bring in are the GDSs and aggregators and have them do either some sort of webinar or in-person meeting where the agencies and airlines can get more information. So again, thank you very much. So I just wanted to walk through again the process flow as it comes through ARC. What you have here on the screen at the top is the NDC model, where the airline sort of owns the offer, they've priced it, and they've issued the ticket. They've done that transmission either through a direct API. And then on the sort of the bottom left, you have the traditional model where the GDS is actually building the content. The agency is requesting the ticket. The GDS, you know, communicates with the airline, but they're issuing the ticket. So some of the benefits or the enhancements that we've just talked about are that ARC will be able to take in a SPRF or a RET file directly from any of the parties. It could be an airline, it could be a GDS, it could be an aggregator. Literally, it could actually be directly from the agency in some cases. If they want to send a sales file to us, either for reporting purposes or to settle cash form of payment, to settle upfront commission, we can do that. Again, I mentioned IATA's NDC link tool, so we can take in the RET file. Hopefully, at some point, we're actually going to be testing. So we'll be able to take in files from really any of the parties that want to send a file to us. Then next, I talked a bit about the credit billing, and again, that's an option. If airlines want us to initiate credit billing, as we do today, we can do that on your behalf, or we can inhibit credit billing, and that transaction would just be reported to us. we would output it to the agency on their back office file, and we would store those transactions in our data warehouse. As I mentioned, NDC and non-NDC transactions will be reported through the agency's sales tool, IAR, and the agency will be able to download their back office file that they do today and receive both NDC and non-NDC transactions. And of course, we'll still for both. Again, I mentioned we can put both NDC and non-NDC transactions on the carrier accounting tape. So we have had an instance, one of our test partners said, you know, go ahead and send us NDC and non-NDC on the CAP file. We're just going to exclude NDC when it comes to loading it into our revenue accounting system, because we've already fed our revenue accounting system from the ticket being issued. So for them, they're just going to ignore those. For others, it might be important to take those in. And then, of course, last, certainly not least, is the cash transmission mechanism we have in place today. So it expands the ability for airlines to be able to issue NDC transactions and still have cash as the form of payment through the agency channel. So we will net NDC and non-NDC together. And from the airline to or from the agency. So I'll pause here in case there are any questions. Any questions about the process or how it might impact settlement through ARC? Okay, great. One more. So we have a couple questions actually. So NDC facilitates and opens the market for new entrants. There will be many IT providers offering many NDC capable solutions. How can an airline find the right one? Wow, that is a big question. And I'll be honest with you, that is not something I can answer for you. We've heard feedback from several airlines around their efforts to move forward with NDC and who they've been working with and some of the pros and cons. I'd be happy to get with you directly and communicate some of that and actually put you in touch with one or two airlines that would definitely be able to provide some of that direct feedback to you. So I'm happy to do that.
And just so everyone knows, we are going to be sharing this presentation as well as the list Shelly mentioned with the aggregators. And we'll also have Shelly's contact information as well as part of that email. So you will be able to reach her directly. Okay, a couple of more questions. One is, what is the CAP file? The CAP file is it's the equivalent of what many of you probably know as the HOT in the BSP world. And that is the file that we transmit to the airlines daily or weekly, mostly daily, and advise the airlines' revenue accounting systems exactly what's been settled through ARC. So it's our main outbound file to the airlines. So a couple of things here. Please provide details for the credit card processing process. So without specifics, I'm not sure if you're asking about today or in the future, but I'll try to answer both as quickly as possible. So today, when we get transactions in from the GDSs on the SPRF file, there in the middle of the graphic, we actually do three key things with that data every day. We extract data behind the scenes where we know for each airline, for each card type, who your processor is. And so we will extract that data and send it to your processor. So whoever you do for Visa, MasterCard, American Express, Discover, of course UATP, we will actually send that file
on behalf of the airline. And then the processor then works with the various banks that the cards are issued on to initiate the settlement of that cash between the bank and the airline. So in the process today, the airline actually receives the funds for credit billing, which we do 365 days a year, directly from the banks or the processor, depending on how your contract is set up. So at a very high level, that's the credit card thing that we can either choose, you can tell us to do or not do with NDC transactions. I hope that answered your question. If not, I'm always happy to hop on the phone with you and answer that. So I think we have here SPRF, RET, and ECCB. What is it? So the SPRF I just mentioned is the system provider reporting file, and that is the file of the daily transactions that the agencies have issued through the various GDSs. So it's straight sales, refunds, exchanges, miscellaneous charge orders, EMDs, a variety of transactions. So we get those daily in on the SPRF file. The RET file is actually IATA's version of that. So the RET is what's transmitted from airlines and GDSs to IATA to set is early credit card billing. And I won't jump off onto that deep ocean for the moment, but suffice it to say is it's our daily billing process. We have a daily and we have a cycle billing. And if you'd like to know more about that, again, I'm happy to set you up with the folks that can really dive into that detail.
And we have a full ARC Settlement 101 video that's available on the education portal behind my ARC. And it goes into more detail on the SPRF, the ECCB file, how all that works, and how all that information is transmitted. So we do have a video available that you can review today. And you're always free to ask the airline help desk if you have additional questions, or any of us here at ARC.
Absolutely. Thank you, Krista. Mm-hmm. So another question come in. Has come in scenario, and when credit card billing is actioned via ARC. So that will actually be in the NDC world. If the airline has gone to get the authorization and possibly put that transaction through their fraud scoring tools that they do, their .com or maybe phone transactions, that will be a discussion that needs to take place between the airline and the agency on how chargebacks for NDC will be handled. And some of it, of course, depends on how you're implementing NDC. But assuming you're sort of implementing the full model where you're, again, owning the transaction, you're getting the authorization. Today, just as a little aside, the agency actually, for transactions that come through the traditional way, the GDS today, they actually transaction with NDC, the airline, of course, in most cases is going to do that. So again, that will have to be a discussion point, and I have a few of those points actually in another slide here that we'll go over. So, can you include the details on all the acronyms and abbreviations with a copy of the deck? Absolutely, will do. Here we go, and the discussion points. And these are just really a sampling of topics that the airline needs to consider in terms of discussions that need to happen both internally within the various departments, revenue management, revenue accounting, distribution, e-commerce, sales, any of your technology folks that are working on these kind of projects. We highly, highly encourage and bring up some of these points. So for instance, on how you are considering implementing NDC, what types of agencies or markets are you going to pursue first? Do you want to go online travel agency, an OTA, a mainly leisure-focused agency, corporate market, which tends to be a little bit more difficult because of the corporate booking tools that are in place, and you have to sort of account for that processing as part of the NDC flow. Or consolidator. Again, just topics to consider as you move forward. How will the agency connect to the airline? Are you going to offer a direct API, or maybe go through a GDS or an aggregator first, or maybe you'll decide to do all of those methods. Also, what types of messages, the NDC actually schema supports shopping, booking, payment, ticketing, servicing, and interline. So what type of transactions are you going to support with your initial sort of kind of NDC kind of project? Are you going to do just shopping and booking? Are you going to do shopping, booking, and payment? Are you going to do all of the message types that are out there? Again, things to consider. We mentioned who's going to be doing the credit card authorization. Again, if you're doing the shopping, booking, payment, ticketing, most likely you're going to be going out to get the authorization just like you do today on your .com transactions. And are you going to put those transactions through fraud? For those of you that are very familiar with the credit card world, initially, when the schema rolled out, 3D Secure was not part of it, but that is currently being added and will be added as part of the NDC schema. So again, it's a whole other topic to consider, and feel free to reach out to us. And then, as we mentioned, credit card chargebacks. How will those be managed? Are you going to be sending a debit memo to the agency for that? Are you going to service them through your existing credit card chargeback kind of process that you're doing for your airline transactions? And then, of course, things like fare types. Are you going to kind of kick off NDC with just filed fares? Are you going to add private fares or net fares as part of the offering? Bundle and offer ancillaries, all types of ancillaries, or maybe just one or two types to start off with? And if so, how will the ancillaries be issued? Will the agency be able to initiate a message for you to create an MCO or an EMD, or maybe you have an internal proprietary document that you're using today for ancillaries? So maybe the ancillary would be issued on that type of document. And then, of course, is it straight sales, refunds, exchanges, and reissues? So what is your initial NDC project going to contain? Then in terms of sort of conversations with the agencies, integration into the agency back and mid-office, their customer invoicing tools, how they service their customers, especially in the event of a regular operation. These are all topics that really need to be brought up with any agency that you're pursuing NDC with. And how will these things be managed? So an example is if an agency is going to come directly to the airline through a direct API, which is kind of a direct connection, a direct line is like I like to call it, into the airline, how is that going to mesh with their back office? Are they going to be able to extract data off of the NDC messages to create a file for themselves, or is somebody going to do that for them? And the airline application of upfront commission, contracts, or fare discounts we talked about. So again, and if you're doing your transaction, if you still offer upfront commissions or discounts, will you be applying those commissions or discounts depending on who the agency is? And of course, one of the topics that came up in one of our meetings was, if that's the case, and the airline is going to apply commission, and it's not going to let the agency make a change to that, the agency is going to actually want to validate those commissions or discounts on behalf of their customers or themselves. So again, these are just some of the topics that are kind of need to be sort of thought about as you're moving through. IATA does have quite a bit of documentation, and I'm happy to refer folks to a couple of those websites that can actually walk through sort of implementation guideline that really sort of sets out a lot of the things that the airlines really need to be thinking about as they either consider or pursue their NDC distribution strategy. So I will take a breath now, and I think one of the questions that we have is, can we get the presentation after the webinar? Absolutely. And again, I will also include a copy of the list of aggregators
and the acronyms.
And sorry,
the acronyms.
The acronyms. Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks, Crystal. So I wonder, are there any other questions, thoughts, comments, anything you'd like to know? That's really it. We're a few minutes early, so I'll open it up and see if anyone else has questions. One of the questions that came in is, could you explain a bit more, give more details on the limitations using the RET, in particular for exchanges? Absolutely. So let me go back real quick here. So in exchanges today in the ARC world, we actually get a lot of the old coupon document information sent to us on the SPRF, the System Provider Reporting File today. And we have a lot of edits in our processing that look for old coupons and amounts and compare them to a database that we have. And so in the REP files, we don't get all of that detail. It's just when we initially started testing and taking those in, it was basically every exchange was failing our edits because we were not getting the detail. So we had to build a workaround where we actually process exchanges as straight sales. So when an exchange comes in, we actually process it as a straight sale. And yes, that does pose some difficulties. But for our test partner, it did not make a difference to them because they did not necessarily need all of the data to be 100% in the exchange format on our outbound file, which we call the CAP file. So that is one example. That was really a lot of detail around the exchange and how we're having to process it. Another example around exchanges is today through the ad collect or there's a refund. We don't require that ad collect or that refund to be on a separate document. So for instance, we don't require that an EMD or an MCO be issued to obtain that ad collect or for the refund. It's actually part of the exchange transaction. In the IATA world, typically an EMD nowadays is issued for that refund or that ad collect. And so 2 transactions actually come in for that. And they're not connected like they normally would be in our processing. So exchange is processed as a straight sale, and then we have that separate EMD that is issued for the ad collect or the refund. Now, I will say on the number that goes back to the original ticket, that will always be there. But in terms of truly having those 2 things connected, we were just not able to do that given how the transaction is sent to us. Sorry, that's probably more detail than you ever wanted to know, but couple of other questions have come in. Is there a live implementation of NDC we could see, aggregator and airline? Not yet. We were crossing our fingers and hoping that we would have a live test partner actually already. We are anxiously awaiting that test partner to come to us with an agency. We think that's actually going to happen soon. So behind the scenes, we can actually walk through. If you need all the technical details, we can certainly provide some of those to you. But in terms of sort of watch, I wish I did have that. That would be kind of cool. Would it be possible to get your SPR file layout specification? Absolutely. It's actually available to our airlines today.
It is, and I'll make sure it's emailed out to everyone.
Sure. When do you think, last question here, when do you think NDC will be in full swing, understanding this is a huge undertaking? Is there an approximate date? Short answer is no, there is not an approximate date, but I will tell you that a number of airlines at one of the last meetings I was at in Singapore, there were several airlines that had committed to pushing for 20% of their volume by 2020. And there were, I think there are about 15 airlines, 15 to 20 airlines that are looking to go that way. That doesn't mean that they're the same, but that's for worldwide. That's not for US. So I would say here in the US, it's moving a bit slower than it is in other parts of the world. So I wish I could give you an answer on that in terms of full swing, but at this point, you know, if I had to break out my crystal ball, I would really say we're still talking three to 4 years before you're going to see any significant volume, at least here in the US. Let's see, can we please organize a seminar with airline and travel partners? Absolutely, we'd be happy to do that.
That's a great idea.
So fantastic idea. So I will work with Crystal and our other agency representative here, and we'll get that done. The documentation of ARC revenues between airlines and agents will lie with ARCs about that. Documentation of ARC revenues. I'm not sure I quite understand the question. So I apologize. There's a couple of different ways I could go with this, and I'd rather not guess.
Yes.
So if you could clarify quickly before we run out of time, I'm happy to try to give it a shot.
And so we have approximately 5 more minutes left in the webinar. So if there are any burning questions that you have, please feel free to submit them now for Shelly to answer. Otherwise, again, you will receive this presentation. It is being recorded and will be available on our education portal, and you will have Shelly's contact information as well. So if there are other questions that you think about later, you're always free to reach us. So we'll have a couple more seconds to see if there's anything that comes in, but I first want to say thank you, Shelly, for the amazing presentation. This was really helpful today. And thank you to all of you that joined on this call. I know, some of you, this may be an early morning or a really late evening, and so we really appreciate you taking your time to join us on this webinar today.
Very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. One last question. I'll try to fit it in. Is there a difference between NDC and one order? Yes. There is a very big difference, and we're actually going to be having another webinar around one order, so be on the lookout for that. So NDC sort of sets things up for one order. We don't have enough time here to sort of get into that today, but be on the lookout.
All right. If you have any more questions, please feel free to submit them, and hope you all have a very wonderful day. Thank you. Bye-bye.